Good day. My name is Kanute Rarey, and I'm a storyteller. I want to tell you a story today about my grandmother. My grandma Schweitzer was really important in my life because my grandpa and grandma Schweitzer and my Aunt Arlene, her daughter, and my Uncle John, her son, they took us, my brothers and I, my two brothers, my brother Fred, who was 8 at the time, and me when I was 6, and my younger brother when I was 4. They brought us into their home to raise after their daughter, my mom, passed away suddenly. And my grandmother just collected us up as little boys and just loved us in all the ways she could love us. But she also put us to work, and particularly in the summertime. And I'm not even going to talk about all the dishes we washed because there weren't any girls in the family, so we boys learned to wash dishes after dinner. But I'm going to talk about the garden that my grandmother tended over, because my grandmother looked out at the garden and she thought of it as her own little kingdom. And she knew just how many rows of each vegetable she wanted in the garden, and she knew just where to put them so the sun would be perfect. And so we planted sweet corn, and we planted tomatoes, and we planted string beans, planted lettuce and carrots, and we planted tomatoes, and all of them grew in that wonderful soil on the farm that we had right there. And Grandma would give us instructions about tending it, and that included when to weed and how much to weed, and did we get all the weeds out of the garden. And we used what was called a rotary hoe with a big wheel that we could run down through the rows in the center of the rows, and we could get those weeds in the center of the rows. And then we had hoes that you could go along and carefully hoe, being careful not to injure any of those vegetables. And then we had a opportunity to be on our hands and knees and pull out those little weeds that got right down there next to the plants. So weeding was a critical thing. So after we had identified the rows and what went into them and planted the seeds and nurtured them and prayed for rain half the time and prayed for the rain to stop the other half the time, we had weeds to contend with because they love to grow just as fast. And Grandma would watch after that process as well and make sure we were doing it. Besides the corn and the beans and the tomatoes and the carrots and the lettuce, we had strawberry patch, which was right out behind the woodshed, and right out there way out there behind the wood, the old outhouse, was a rhubarb patch. And we had rhubarb. We planted some squash too back there so it could really get out there and the vines could be free to scurry around wherever they wanted to be. And we always had a wonderful harvest of lots of plants. But one of my fondest memories of my grandmother is being on the cistern where they collected well water, sitting on the cistern with my grandmother, my Grandma Rarey, and my Grandma Schweitzer. I had a Grandma Rarey too, but a Grandma Schweitzer. And we would sit there and we would shell those beans and drop them into a big old basket and shell the beans and drop the parts over into a bucket and separate those two. And she would take not only those beans, but she would take beans and corn and tomatoes, and she would take them in. She would can them, using a pressure cooker in those jars, those ball jars with the lids. And then we would take them down to the fruit cellar, and we would have them in the fruit cellar, rows and rows and shelves that we would have for the winter. And then, of course, when she was preparing food, she would always send us down there to get a jar of whatever we needed at the time. We also had potatoes, and we would harvest those potatoes, and we would take those and keep them in the fruit cellar as well. And Grandma tended a chicken house. So we had a chicken house, and we collected eggs every day, more in the summer and less in the winter, and we would keep those down. We even had so many we could sell them, and Grandma could make some pin money from selling the eggs. But my grandmother, by the time, as she got older, so she began to just be watching us watching us tend the garden and bring things up, and she would be helping with things. She helped my Aunt Arlene. My Aunt Arlene stayed at home and worked at home. and she would help Aunt Arlene get ready for dinner because she kind of backed off from dinner. Grandma, she was probably really a great cook probably when she was young, and when she had a family of 3 children and a working father, my grandfather, to prepare food for. But by the time we came along at the age of 65, she really wasn't that excited about cooking anymore. They had invented the black and white TV, and they had begun to produce daytime TV shows. The Edge of Night was out there as one of the first, and she was hooked on that, if you will. And so sometimes, we would come home from school, and almost always we would find her watching daytime TV and not being that great. She really wasn't that kind of grandmother that would make the cookies and make the cakes, and she was kind of through with cooking. But she would get everything together for my Aunt Arlene before she came home, so she could finish dinner as she got older. And we boys would come home, and of course there weren't any snacks to have. They didn't buy and make snacks at the time. There were potatoes, and when she was carving potatoes out and peeling the potatoes, getting them ready for dinner, she'd be peeling them, and we'd come in from school or from work, and we'd sneak a potato before we went out to do our chores, and she would just scold us, boys, we're not going to have enough potatoes for dinner if you keep eating those potatoes. And then she'd have to peel another and peel another. But we were ornery about those potatoes. And she would I said she liked to watch daytime TV, and she would forget about what was going on behind her and in the kitchen, right in the next room, while she was watching daytime TV. And she would put water on to boil, and the water would boil and boil and boil, and pretty soon the water would just explode. The kettle would get dry, and the kettle would explode. Those old aluminum kettles, would blow out the bottom of them, and we had a trash pile that we always took to the woods. Whether that's environmentally friendly today or not, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's probably not. But my grandmother and grandpa and grandma, they had that back in the woods, and but there were these trash piles, and we would always laugh when we saw those exploded kettles, because Grandma would have forgotten to go get the kettle off the stove before it blew up. And every once in a while that happened. And Grandma actually set the cabinets on fire in the kitchen a couple times. Fortunately, the house didn't burn down and nobody got hurt. But she got to be a little distracted over time. And it just makes me smile when I think of Grandma and her cooking, especially in her old age. But the one thing she did love and have domain over for many, many, many years, for as long as I can remember, was that garden. And she loved the garden, and she loved growing plants. And we, of course, helped and assisted with that, as I described. And the one thing that she had in that garden was she had all of those things that she contributed to us, all of those things that made our lives better because of the food that she grew, that we grew together, but that she oversaw. And the times that I was there snapping the beans and preparing the cans for canning and helping her with that process in the garden, helping weed in the garden, and helping in the strawberry patch and collecting that corn and the tomatoes and checking to see if they're ripe. And even today with our little garden that I described, that I mentioned in the beginning of this story, that little garden that we have today, when I think about picking a tomato or picking some basil, I think of my grandmother and I think of her. And that's what brought her to mind this morning when I was sitting on the porch. And I wanted to share that with you today, and it reminded me of all the love that my grandmother had for us, and how she nurtured us and took care of us as we grew up as children on the farm. Thank you.